bodies to teach medical students anatomy. Did I read that accurately?
Yes.
Can we agree that when you gave the answer to this question, you did not say anything about in excess of 200 pounds or 220 pounds? Is that true?
All I said would take the weight of several officers on the torso and abdominal area. That's exactly what I said.
Sir, I just asked you if you made any reference to having a weight that exceeds either 200 or 220 pounds. Did you make any such reference, yes or no?
I didn't give a specific weight, I just said several officers.
So we know here, in this case, when Mr. Chauvin was on Mr. Floyd's back and neck, from time to time he was pressing down forcefully with his knee also on the left arm. You saw the knee on the left arm from time to time, didn't you, sir?
Yes, I did.
I want to ask you in that framework about another quote from Spitz and Fisher, Exhibit 814 for identification purposes on page 833. I'm sorry, sir. 833. Contrary to the belief of some, it is our opinion that pinning down the shoulders or forcefully pressing down the arms is equivalent to loading the back. A struggling, agitated individual breathes faster, has a faster heartbeat, elevated blood pressure, and heightened metabolism. Such an individual requires more air and more oxygen. Immobilization of the chest, even if only partially reducing the ability to maintain vital functions, culminates in cardiac arrhythmia. Do you agree with the statement from Spitz and Fisher? Sure.
No, specifically, I do not. They stated it is their opinion, and again, this is a medical opinion expressed by those particular authors. It's not a scientific fact.
Thank you, Brent. Dr. Fowler, do you agree that with Mr. Floyd in a prone stomach down position, with Mr. Chauvin applying some pressure to the neck and pressure to the torso in a downward position, that these forces would be symbiotic? They would actually add together. Is that true?
Yes, I agree. In the paper by Kroll, as I quoted earlier on, the single knee...
Dr. Fowler, I just asked if it was true.
Yes, Dr. Kroll confirmed that.
And all those things together would make somebody more likely than if those factors weren't present. It would make it more likely for them to succumb to asphyxia, correct?
If the weight is sufficient, yes.
You told us, Dr. Fowler, that you had been able to catch some of the testimony at the trial from some of the other medical persons who testified. You didn't see all of it, but you've seen some of it.
That is correct, sir, yes.
Are you then aware that a number of medical experts and others have testified that Mr. Floyd died primarily to the effects of low oxygen that arose out of Mr. Chauvin's subdual restraint and neck compression? Are you aware that a number of persons have testified about that?
Yes, I am.
I'd like to talk with you about what specifically you have done to actually assess what Mr. Floyd's actual oxygen reserves would have been during the subdual, restraint, and compression on May 25th of 2020 while he was underneath the body of Mr. Chauvin. You wrote a report containing your opinions in this case, and it is dated on February 22nd of 2021, right?
Yes.
I will represent to you and assume for purposes of my questions that end expiratory lung volumes, or EELV, is the amount of air that remains in your chest between breaths. Will you accept that as a premise for my question?
The end respiratory lung volume?
Yes,
Is that
sir.
what you're referring to?
The EELV, yes.
Yes.
And I'll refer to that commonly as simply the body's oxygen reserves, just as a common way to refer to it. And
It's the air that's left in your lungs. It's not the body's oxygen reserve. Your major oxygen reserve is in the oxygen dissolved in your bloodstream.
we'll just call it the EELV then, okay?
Thank you.
Right. Do you agree that as the EELV decreases, that it takes more work to breathe?
I believe so, yes.
Incidentally, you were having a discussion, had a discussion with Mr. Nelson about the hypopharynx. You recall that discussion?
Yes.
Now, the report that you prepared in this case was 31 pages or thereabouts. Fair enough?
Yes.
Can we agree that the word hypopharynx doesn't appear in your report in any of the 31 pages expressing your opinions, does it?
That is correct.
Now, you had made some comment earlier that you couldn't find anything in the literature about whether the hypopharynx may be impeded by restraints on the back. Do you recall that discussion?
Yes.
And I take it you went to look at forensic pathology studies in that regard, didn't you?
I searched the general literature and forensic pathology sources, yes.
Did you look actually in physiology journals, sir?
That I would consider to be part of the general medical literature.
So yes, you did look in physiology journals.
I searched broadly for it. I don't know whether I did not specifically focus on look in physiology journals only.
Well, I don't want to confuse the jury now. Do you?
No.
Do you? I'm sorry, Judge.
Let's go sidebar, please. I'm sorry, you can restate the question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Fowler, I was simply trying to get a clear answer, if you can give us one. Do you have a specific recollection of actually looking at physiology journals on the question of the relationship between the hypopharynx and the ability to breathe?
I specifically did a PubMed search, which includes human physiology journals, and nothing came up on my search. So therefore I did not read any physiology journals on this because nothing came up in the search.
So, Dr. Fowler, did you calculate quantitatively and include in your report what Mr. Floyd's EELV was while he was sitting on the sidewalk before the subdual and restraint began on the ground?
No, I don't believe I did.
Did you calculate and record the amount of air he took in with each breath at any point in time, either before or during the subdual and restraint on the ground?
No.
Did you do any quantitative assessment in your report for the time while he was sitting on the sidewalk by the Dragon Walk, or whether his breathing, his EELV, was either normal or whether it was abnormal?
No, I did not.
Incidentally, if his EELV was 89, that is 89 millimeters of mercury, would you agree that that would have been normal then, before the time of his subdual and restraint on the ground?
I typically do not do pulmonary medicine, so the exact ranges of human beings are not something that I classically keep in my head, so I don't know that number, Councillor.
When Mr. Floyd then was laid prone on the street, when he's face down, did you do any calculations of what any reduction may have been in his EELV due to him being placed in a prone position?
No.
When Mr. Chauvin had his knees on Mr. Floyd's back, left arm and left side, did you do any calculations quantitatively for how that weight on the back would have had any impact on his EELV?
No, I did not.
Would you agree with me then that as the EELV goes down, do you agree that as that goes down, it takes more work to breathe?
That is my understanding, but I'm not a pulmonary physician.
All right, so fair enough. For that, you would defer to a pulmonary physician.
For more detail, yes.
Well, let me ask you this, and you will tell me if I'm asking the wrong person, Dr. Fowler. Would you agree that pressure on the soft side of the neck also narrows the size of the upper airway, the hypopharynx?
I have not seen any literature which indicates that that happens. That was one of the specific things I searched for. Because you're correct, Councillor, it was not something that was put into the report, because it's not something that I have ever heard of. And so I then went and looked for pressure on the neck causing restriction of the hypopharynx, and my literature search was not fruitful.
Thank you, Dr. Fowler. If we might show Exhibit 941, it's already in evidence. So showing you, Dr. Fowler, what has been entered in the evidence as Exhibit 941. If we look at the left picture, we can see here, and I'll represent to you this Mr. Chauvin, who's on top of Mr. Floyd. You can see here Mr. Chauvin's knee on the back part of the neck in the left photograph. Can you see that, sir?
Yes.
And then on the right picture, you can see that his knee is on the side of the neck, on the soft side. Can you see that also?
Yes, on the back of the right side of the neck.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Brett. And I think you referred to Mr. Floyd's death as a sudden death event. Is that the word you used?
Yes, more sudden than prolonged.
If we focus on the first 5 minutes that Mr. Floyd is restrained on the ground, you were able to see in that 5 minutes, first saw Mr. Floyd just struggling to breathe, right? Well, I'll rephrase it, Jan. You could see in the first 5 minutes, or hear that Mr. Floyd was first calling out that he can't breathe.
Correct. Mr. Floyd verbalized, "I can't breathe," multiple times.
And you then later heard him actually call out for his mother.
Yes.
And as time passed in that first 5 minutes, you could hear that his voice got thicker and quieter. You could hear that, couldn't you?
I did not perceive that, but I'm no better at listening than anybody else is, so anybody can make up their own opinion with regard to that.
But to your hearing, you didn't hear any change in Mr. Floyd's voice. Is that what you're saying, sir?
Not that I noticed.
Did you notice that during the 5 minutes that his words got further apart?
Yes, they did.
Did you notice that after roughly 4 minutes and 45 seconds that Mr. Floyd went unconscious?
Yes.
Then did you notice that sometime after 5 minutes, he was found not to have had a pulse?
Correct.
In your report, you refer to this as a sudden death event, but in your report and your findings, you don't record a time, do you, sir, for when the sudden death supposedly occurred, do you?
I don't specifically remember doing that. Correct.
So if we look at this continuum from hearing George Floyd calling out that he can't breathe to the point that he doesn't have a pulse over that 5-minute time period, is it fair to say that that is what you're referring to as a sudden death?
No.
All right. Then, all right, I asked you the question about when the sudden death occurred. Where in this spectrum, then, it's okay if you don't know the specific time, but where in this continuum did the sudden death occur from the time he is on the ground saying he can't breathe to the point in time he's found not to have a pulse? Are you able to generally characterize where the sudden death took place?
So, what you're referring to as a sudden death, and I may well have misinterpreted, I'm referring to as a sudden cardiac arrest. There's a difference between death and cardiac arrest. Cardiac arrest is not absolutely irreversible and not synonymous with a person always passing away. So there's going to be a period of time between his cardiac arrest. For instance, in this particular case, the official pronouncement was done in the hospital. Frankly, he was dead long before that. But the moment of death is not something that you can easily document.
So when we are in this space where there is a space between cardiac arrest and between the actual death, are you suggesting that though Mr. Floyd may have been in cardiac arrest, there was a time when he may have been revived because he wasn't dead yet?
Immediate medical attention for a person who's gone into cardiac arrest may well reverse that process, yes.
Do you feel that Mr. Floyd should have been given immediate emergency attention to try to reverse the cardiac arrest?
As a physician, I would agree.
Are you critical of the fact that he wasn't given immediate emergency care when he went into cardiac arrest?
Yeah, as a physician, I would agree.
When you were observing the footage of Mr. Floyd after he's gone unconscious, there's a point in time where you see his legs raise up. Do you recall seeing his legs raised at the point after he was unconscious on the ground?
Yes.
Was that leg raising, was that consistent with what's known as an anoxic seizure?
That is what we would typically call it, yes.
And an anoxic seizure typically represents that there has been some damage to the brainstem due to insufficient oxygen. True?
It's anoxic, or in some cases we would call it hypoxic seizure, and it's not damage to the brainstem. It means that the part of the brain that governs our actual muscular movement, which is the higher portion of the brain, is not functioning properly. So typically people with seizure disorders who have seizure activity, it's from the motor cortex and not from down at the brainstem. If you've damaged the brainstem at that particular stage, the person is effectively going to be deceased.
So, but it's fair to say when we see an anoxic seizure, at the very least, we know that the brain is suffering from insufficient oxygen.
Yes.
Do you agree that low oxygen in the body, insufficient oxygen, it can cause brain injury, can't it?
Absolutely.
And it can also result in PEA, pulseless electrical activity. True?
True.
Now, Mr. Floyd had a PEA, a pulseless electrical activity arrhythmia, when his body was taken away from the scene on May 25th, 2020, didn't he?
Correct.
Is it true, Dr. Fowler, that the most common cause of a PEA is low oxygen, insufficient oxygen?
To the brain?
Yes, sir.
Yes, which can also be caused by a cardiac standstill. So no oxygen to the brain from either mechanism will cause PEA.
I had a number of questions. I'm kind of thinking through them. I'll just ask you this. I had a number of questions that have to do with whether you did any sort of quantitative measurements about Mr. Floyd's oxygen levels, his EELV, at different points in time, including at what point in time do you think his oxygen stores were completely depleted? I take it, Dr. Fowler, if I have any questions about quantitative measurements about Mr. Floyd's EELV, those would not have been measurements that you would have undertaken for any reason, right?
Correct.
And to the extent we are looking for such measurements, better to ask either a pulmonologist, a respiratory physiologist, but not necessarily, not Dr. Fowler as a forensic pathologist. Fair enough?
Fair enough. Forensic pathologists do not typically look at living people who are breathing.
By the same token, if I had a series of questions about measurements of the carbon dioxide levels in Mr. Floyd's body after he ceased to breathe, between the time that he ceased to breathe and before the time he was given oxygen, when he was picked up and given medical care and taken to Hennepin County Medical Center. You didn't do any quantitative analysis, did you, as to the carbon dioxide levels in Mr. Floyd's body in between the time he ceased to breathe and then the time he would receive assisted oxygen?
No, not specific quantitative analysis, no.
Now, you had quite a discussion about the paraganglioma. Remember that discussion?
Yes.
Do you know we had a witness who testified who refers to it as an incidentaloma? You ever heard that expression before?
Yes.
Now, you talked about the paraganglioma potentially being an issue if it were secreting adrenaline, right?
Correct.
90% of paragangliomas do not secrete adrenaline. Is that right? Is that right?
I think that's probably correct. I don't have that number in my head, but I have no reason to disbelieve that.
Now, you're not telling the jury, are you, sir, that Mr. Floyd died from a paraganglioma, are you?
No.
And although Dr. Baker did identify the paraganglioma on autopsy, he didn't perform any test to determine whether it was a secreting tumor, that is, secreting adrenaline, did he?
Correct. The only way to test those particular tumors is there's two methods to test. One is to do a blood test, and if the paraganglionoma is one which is constantly secreting, you will pick it up on a blood test. For those paragangliomas that tend to be cyclical, if you do a blood test and you happen to pick it up at the bottom of a cycle, it won't show. And so in some cases, the first test is to do a blood test. If it's positive, you've got your answer. If that blood test is negative, you then go on to do a 24-hour urine catecholamine screen, which will pick up the surges and the dips. And that is then the second test that would be done in these cases. Neither of them were done.
Doctor, just for clarification, is it pronounced paraganglioma or paraganglionoma?
Yeah, I often add in the extra vowel, so it's a paraganglioma. Paraganglioma, sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Fowler. Now, is it true that in all the world literature, there have only been 6 reported cases of people who have died from a sudden heart event from adrenaline release from a paraganglioma? Is that true?
That's what the literature says, because in many cases it may go completely unrecognized.
I just asked if it was true, Dr.
Yes, that's
Fowler.
what's in the literature.
Now, one of the signature hallmarks for paraganglioma is a headache, right?
If it is one that does secretion at surge and then dip and surge. So if it's one that constantly secretes a small amount, it will not cause any symptoms at all.
Right. But to the extent, we know that amongst the various complaints that Mr. Floyd had about pains, he never did complain about a headache, did he?
I seem to remember one admission where he complained of a headache, but I'm going from memory now, and I am not sure.
And here I'm referring to on May 25th of last year. You have a recollection that Mr. Floyd complained of a headache?
I know he complained of tooth pain and a few other things, but I can't be sure that he did not complain of a headache. I do not have a clear recollection, Councillor.
Right. I won't hold you to that then.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Fowler, you asked some questions about Mr. Floyd saying, "I can't breathe," before he was put on the ground during the subdual and the restraint. Do you recall that discussion?
Yes.
Were you able to see what was happening with Mr. Floyd as they were trying to get him into what's referred to as Squad 320?
Yes.
Were you aware of whether or not Mr. Floyd was experiencing being choked as he was being put into the back of Squad 320?
I did not see a limb around his neck from my recollection. That's not something that I noticed.
Your Honor and Counsel, I have a couple of stills from Exhibit 43 that's already in. And these are numbered Exhibits 281 and 282. And I would offer those stills from Exhibit 43 already in evidence.
Any objection?
281, 282, Counsel?
Yes, sir. May I, Your Honor? Just
281 and 282 are received.
thank you, Your Honor. So we could first, Brad, if we could show 282. Can you see here in 282, this area? Do you see where I've circled, Dr. Fowler?
Yes.
And do you see this arm that is around Mr. Floyd's neck?
Yes.
Do you recognize this person to be Mr. Chauvin?
It appears to be yes.
And if I could show you 281. I'm sorry, Your Honor, if you could. And here we see the top of Mr. Floyd's face. And then there's a hand here on his neck. Do you see that?
Yes.
And so you, these weren't images or scenes that you had paid special attention to before as you looked at what was going on in Squad 320? You had not seen any arms or anything around Mr. Floyd's neck?
No, I'd seen these particular sections. I'm sorry if I misinterpreted your question. You said before he went into squad 320. I apologize if I misinterpreted your question.
And so do you know whether when Mr. Floyd was into the back of squad 320 and before he's pulled out, whether he complained about being choked? Did he say, "I'm getting choked"?
I believe he did, yes.
And it doesn't take a medical doctor such as yourself to know that if somebody feeling that they are getting choked, well, that would be a good reason why they would say they can't breathe.
Yes.
I wanted Dr. Fowler to see if you could just clear up a couple of things for me just in the timeline of what happened with respect to Mr. Floyd and restraint on the ground. Was the leg extension, the anoxic seizure as we've referred to it, was that before he lost consciousness or was it after he had lost consciousness?
After.
Okay. And did you make a note of when Mr. Floyd's, when was his last vocal sound? Do you remember?
Somewhere between a minute, 45 seconds and a minute before, I've got the information written down somewhere, before he went unconscious was about the last time that he actually vocalized.
If we focus in on the period of the subdual restraint and the neck compression, was there ever a time when, during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, where you saw Mr. Floyd either sleepy, unarousable, or anything that's akin to being in a coma?
So from the period after he has those hypoxic seizures?
Or from the time he's first put on the ground, that he's pulled out of the car, squad 320, he's subdued and restrained on the ground, Mr. Chauvin is on his neck and back. Did you ever see Mr. Floyd at any time manifest either sleepiness, a lack of awareness, that he wasn't arousable, or that sort of thing?
No, not until he lost consciousness.
And typically, doctor, when somebody passes away from a fentanyl or opioid overdose, one of the hallmarks of that is that they are very sleepy, and they will tend to be unarousable and pass away in essentially a coma, right?
Correct. If they are passing away from fentanyl overdose, that's what happens.
And Mr. Floyd was manifesting none of those outward symptoms, was he, on the ground?
Correct. It does not exclude the fact that it was still having a depressive effect on his respiratory system.
Well, before he lost consciousness, his respiration rate, I think you told us that you agree with Dr. Tobin, was somewhere in the ballpark of 22 breaths a minute, right?
Correct.
That is normal, isn't it?
Yes.
If fentanyl was affecting his respiration, then you would expect a respiratory rate that would have been appreciably less than 22 breaths a minute if it's depressing his respiratory system, right?
Unless he should have been breathing at 30 at that particular stage because of his exertion and other stressors.
And you have no really basis or baseline to suggest that Mr. Floyd should have been breathing at 30 instead of the normal 22, right?
A person who is getting short of oxygen to their brain will often increase or usually increase their respiratory rate to more than 30.
I want to talk with you a bit about the methamphetamine. First, let me clear up, if I can, this issue of pills again in the car on May 25th. When Dr. Baker performed the autopsy, isn't it true that there weren't any pills found in Mr. Floyd's stomach?
Correct. Dr. Baker did not identify any pill, tablet, call you what you want, residue within the stomach.
And obviously, any pill that's found in a car is a pill that's not in Mr. Floyd's body.
Correct. Whatever the residual amount in those tablets was not in his body.
Now, I think you made a statement with respect to the methamphetamine that it was not accompanied by a metabolite commonly seen if the meth had been in the system for an appreciable period of time.
Yes.
And I want to kind of be clear on this. Have you, since making the statement in your report, learned that in fact the metabolite of methamphetamine, that is, amphetamine as the metabolite, was present in Mr. Floyd's bloodstream from the toxicology results?
I have heard a statement to that fact. Yes.
Did you investigate the statement to determine whether or not it was true?
Yes.
And did you find that contrary to what you had written in your report, you in fact found that the metabolite of methamphetamine was present from the toxicology results for Mr. Floyd?
In very low levels, so it did not change my opinion.
Well, the methamphetamine itself was only present in very low levels. Isn't that true?
That is true.
And so if there's not a lot of meth, then there won't be a lot of the metabolite either. That makes sense, doesn't it?
Correct. And or again, substantial amount of whatever methamphetamine is there has not yet been metabolized.
So what was the level of methamphetamine that was found in his toxicology results? Do you remember?
Not offhand, no.
How about 19 nanograms per milliliter? Does that sound right?
It sounded right. I did not want to say it because I did not want to be inaccurate.
Yeah. Thank you, doctor. 19 nanograms of methamphetamine is within the range of what you would see in a patient whose doctor prescribed a therapeutic dose of methamphetamine. True?
That is true if methamphetamine is used in a therapeutic environment.
Your Honor, could I have just 1 second? So last question, Dr. Fowler, then I will sit down for now. I wanted to, again, just address the timeline from your report. And I will read it to you, and my question will be whether or not this is the timeline that you stand behind, if I may. So at 8:24:09, the last audible vocal sounds identifiable as Mr. Floyd's are heard. Soon thereafter, voices from bystanders tell police he is not breathing. Mr. Floyd exhibits extension movements of right lower extremity at 8:24:21 and movements of his right arm at 8:24:33. At 8:25:16, Mr. Floyd appears to have passed out. So, representation from your report Is that your best knowledge and information, sir?
That's the information I extracted at that time. Yes.
And you stand by that too at this time, correct?
I have no reason to disagree with that at this time now.
Yeah. Dr. Fowler, thank you.
Nelson, should we break at this time, or can you be brief? Break?
Yeah.
All right,
Great.
break. We'll take our 20-minute break. Let's try and think about 10 after. Doctor's still under oath.
Yes, I'm on it, guys.
Good afternoon, sir. A few follow-up questions, Dr. Fowler. First of all, you